Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here with Sean Smith, the intentional, sensational, urban micro farmer. Sean, do you like that?
I love it.
The urban micro farmer, I think this is sort of something that's a bit new, maybe in the vernacular. But tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I used to be an academic for 20 years, and my time in the academy was kind of coming to an end. I was looking for something during the summers to kind of smooth out, the academic year work in the fall and winter. And I wanted to be outdoors. I wanted to be getting my hands dirty. I wanted something kind of the opposite of being on a computer and being an academic all the time. I wanted to do something connected to climate change.
Yeah.
I wanted to do something where I could teach my kids something. And what turned into trying to relearn a generation of food growing knowledge that had skipped in my family. I was never taught anything about how to grow vegetables. Turned into, a backyard garden that grew and expanded and grew and expanded. And then a learning experience with how to make compost and how to make a soil amendment called compost tea. And then it started to dawn on me that this could be that thing that would allow me to, to scale up something I was already doing for myself and do it for other people in the area. And something that I could, be happy with, something that I could really be, I could get behind as a, a kind of effort or work or passion that I could believe in. And, 5 years later, Crooked Farmz is that backyard micro farm. I like to call it my, what a farm would be if IKEA imagined a farm in the city. And, you think there's lots of gardeners around, obviously, and to say farm has a slightly different relationship to the earth, to the act of growing. And it can be kind of a solitary vocation sometimes. And then to meet a community in Toronto of people who are not only gardening, but backyard farming, and practicing urban agriculture on scales up to almost an acre, within our city, ended up becoming, a really exciting, an exciting moment for me.
That's so cool, because I would probably consider myself not even a gardener, but I do value that. I grew up with my grandmother in the backyard, kind of like cultivating the land and making like vegetables and growing vegetables and helping her tend to her garden in the back. And so that was what I grew up with. And so it feels very natural to have a garden in the backyard. Yeah. But what you are doing is very intentional in terms of even what you said, like the choice of farming a farm versus a garden and the relationship to the earth. It's very interesting. And I will be the first to admit that I don't know very much about this, but I am very much fascinated, because for us, with our little small patch of property, having a garden, and having our children kind of be a part of planting early in the season, watering it, and then taking the yield and picking, this year we grew tons and tons and tons of cherry tomatoes, and the satisfaction of picking it and eating it. And that connection with the earth has been great. So I'd love it if you can elaborate on micro farming and how it's growing and the awareness and why it's so important for city folks to be aware of it, and how there's so many changing dynamics.
Well, there's a few ways to answer that question. I think the first thing I want to talk about is to go back to that story you talked about, you and your grandmother. And I think that's really beautiful, because food growing ought to have a storytelling aspect to it.
Yeah.
It is a relational practice, and it's a relational practice between generations, family members, between community members.
Totally.
But it's also a relational practice, or it ought to be, with the plants themselves, the soil, the insects, the birds, the earthworms, the microbes. We are all connected. And I think anytime we get a chance to viscerally experience that in the act of growing, is super important. And so for you to have had that experience growing up with your grandmother, obviously it stayed with you today.
Yeah.
And that's very powerful. And you can tell how powerful that is. What's changed since that time with your grandmother is, the computerization of the world, right? And our disconnect from the soil, the earth,
Totally.
from sensuous outdoor experiences.
Yeah.
And so, you also mentioned we would plant in the spring and there was a certain rhythm to when we planted and when we harvested. And I think knowing about, or learning about, knowing is a pretty powerful word, but learning about seasonal rhythms and what that means and when we ought to plant something, and when we ought not to plant something, or maybe we should wait a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And that these are things that are our lifetimes of experience, and comes back to the storytelling, why that's so important, because your grandmother spent her whole life learning those lessons so that she could pass them to you in that moment.
Yeah.
And when we're kind of indoors all the time and when we're on computers all the time, we lose that connection to rhythmic, seasonality.
Even like the way people process food, like when I even say process food, like how we eat food or how everything comes in these packages, or you can get meat that's already chopped, like really disconnected from this is the thigh, this is, and understanding, what part of the animal this comes from. And people are living such fast-paced lives that they just order food online. It comes delivered. Everything's pre-made. That it feels even further disconnected.
You're opening up a really big can of worms there, literally. I mean, our relationship to food is everything.
Yeah.
And the way that, sort of industrialized agriculture has grown food over the 20th century by taking the chemicals from World War I and repurposing them as agricultural inputs. And that was the beginning of a chemical agriculture in the United States that was then spread to the rest of the world through the Green Revolution.
Yeah.
That's a disconnect from how we grow food. But then, when we talk about this processing, the industrialization of food preparation, and food mechanization and food automation, we likewise, I mentioned before, we lose that connection to relation and storytelling. Food is a storytelling medium. It's a relational medium. We're sitting here having tea.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a shared relation right now.
Yeah.
And, we have different flavors of tea and we tell stories about those teas and where they come from and when we tried them or when I've never had this before.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful because it's our most common grounding experience, right?
Yeah.
How do we sustain ourselves? How do we sustain our relation? How do we sustain our community?
Yeah. No, and it's such an interesting way to think about it. And so I think about knowing you and how you show up at school, starting, the schools like, compost club or, and getting kids involved and having everyone learn about it is really important. And I think that knowledge the learning is really important because it's how we care for the earth, how we care for ourselves and really as a connection. And I mean, in terms of, you live in Toronto, you have a small farm in your backyard, which would, be IKEA worthy farm. What has been some of your learnings as you have entered this space and transitioning from academia into becoming an urban farmer?
I mean, I think somebody asked me this question the other day about motivations. And in the beginning, the motivation was, what could I do for work?
Yeah.
What could I do that I would be happy doing? Where a career transition was taking place. And as that started to unfold and you learn more about what you're doing, interestingly enough, the motivations change as well, right? So that motivation became a motivation of, how do we develop green local economy and a circular economy and a zero carbon economy. And so that becomes a new motivation. I'm very motivated about climate change and what kind of world are we leaving for our kids? And so when you learn about the importance of composting to literally capturing carbon out of the atmosphere and sinking it into the soil, in this act that we call carbon sequestration, and that even on a very, very, very small scale, I could contribute to that in my backyard. That became a motivation. It's like, okay, now how do we get more people doing this? This is a really big deal. When you learn more about how much being at a farmer's market is like trying to be a teacher in a classroom.
Yeah.
And so that former identity and lifestyle that I was leaving behind was actually my new lifestyle as well. And now you're still a teacher and you're still trying to share ideas with people. And that brown liquid that's on your table at the tent, it matters. And I'm going to tell you why it matters. And so that became a motivation as well. And so these are things I've learned about myself, I think, as going through this process. And at the same time, hopefully helping other people learn something about it as well.
So totally, 100%. And I can see how they all come together in this fluid dynamic. Compost tea,
Yeah.
What is it?
Okay, so when you make compost, it's composed of two main elements. One is organic matter. So the organics that you've, your kitchen scraps or your leaves or whatnot, they're breaking down. And that's organic matter. And that's really important because when you have soil, it's composed of part inorganic, which is like ground down rocks that have been weathered over like thousands and thousands of years.
Okay.
And then organic matter.
Okay.
And air and water. And so if we don't have organic matter in our soil, we've got rock.
Okay.
We've got
so
dust.
No nutrition.
There's no nutrition. There's no life. The other thing that's in compost are microbes. And so we're talking bacteria and fungi and nematodes and protozoa. And I get more excited the more I learn about these things because it's this fascinating world underground that we really know very little about. When you make compost tea, what you're doing is taking the microbes out of that, matter.
Okay.
And putting them into a liquid, literally like making a pot of tea.
Wow.
So here we are drinking tea together. And imagine me putting some compost into the pot.
Yeah.
And the microbes are going to kind of soak out of that, the leaves.
Okay.
And they're going to be in solution. And what happens is we can feed now. I could take this liquid and I could feed it molasses, say.
Okay.
And the sugar in the molasses is going to feed the bacteria and they're going to start to reproduce.
Okay.
Or I could feed powdered oatmeal.
Okay.
And the fungi in this liquid are going to start to reproduce.
Okay.
Powdered kelp. I could feed a whole bunch of things. And what happens is now we can create a super drink where these microbes are really starting to proliferate and multiply. And then we pour it into our soil. And if you've ever had probiotics for your gut microbiome, we're doing the same thing with compost tea. We're putting those microbes right into the root zone where the plants can do their business.
Okay, so when is the best time to use compost tea?
Definitely at the beginning of the season. We're trying to kind of set your garden or farm up for success at the very beginning. But again, I try to do it monthly, or even more frequently.
Okay.
The soils we have in the city are really poor.
Okay.
Right? They're compacted. They're polluted. We water with tap water, which has been chlorinated, which is antimicrobial.
Yeah.
So every practice we do in the city is against microbes. And more and more and more, we know that microbes are necessary for plants to live, for plants to thrive.
Wow. So it's like when you're watering your plants, house plants inside the house, you're basically doing the opposite with your tap water.
Yeah.
So you should probably use rainwater that you collect from outside.
Totally.
Wow.
So it's always best to use rainwater. Always best to use rainwater. And then when I make compost tea, I will take tap water and I can treat it with like a little solution that you would put in aquariums for fish.
Yes.
That takes the chlorine out of that so fish can thrive. I can do that. Or you use tap water. Yeah. So there's kind of I call it the hierarchy of water.
No, but that's really important, right? Because I mean, the water that we drink, which is like the best water in the world because it's that got, chlorine and it's for us that we can just drink it straight, is good on one hand, but bad in another. And I just learned something totally new, which is amazing, Sean. Of course I would learn something from you. That's really cool. So this compost tea, start at the beginning of the season. Do you just Do you use the compost tea and water your soil, or do you plant it and then water?
You could do it a couple of different ways. Watering into your soil is okay if there's organic matter in the soil, because what you're trying to do is put the microbes into a place where they can continue thriving. And so they need organic matter to feed on. They need a moist environment to thrive. What they mostly need, though, is plant roots. So when a plant photosynthesizes from the sun, it's producing sugars.
Okay.
Only about a third, 20% to 30% of those sugars are actually being used by the plant themselves. The rest, about 70%, they're leaking out the bottom of the plant into the roots, and it goes out into the soil, these liquid sugars. And that's what the bacteria and the fungi and the nematodes and the protozoa are feeding on. So they stay alive by this liquid sugar, liquid carbon, we call it, that's coming from photosynthesis. Mm-hmm. And so you want living plants mostly.
Okay.
So when you pour this stuff in, it's always best to have plants already in the ground.
Okay. That's good. Because I've purchased your compost tea before and I just poured it, but now I know how to do it more properly. And it's the season. It's going to be the start of the season. Yep. So get another order in for sure.
And we learn more about it all the time too. It's also dependent on the kinds of crops you want.
Yeah.
So, if you grow a golf course turf lawn, that soil is going to be very bacterial.
Okay.
And if you go to the opposite end of the spectrum and go into an old growth forest, it's going to be very fungal, that soil. Very, very highly fungal. And this is why we find mushrooms when we're on walks in the forest, right?
Sure.
Because that soil is intensely, intensely fungal. And if we're trying to grow something in between, like our field crops or our corn or our grains or our shrubs, we want something that's, about half fungal, half bacterial. And we can try and get the soil there by applying compost tea.
So do you have different kinds of compost tea?
I can tweak it. I can tweak it to make it one or the other. I told you before that we could take that tea and I could feed it this and make it more bacterial, or I could feed it that and make it more fungal. And so what we can do is try and swing it one way or the other by the way we make our compost and also by the way we feed our compost tea.
Well, I find it really interesting because if we just take a step back and look at it from being in the city and with city folks who want to beautify their gardens, who want to have beautiful lawns and stuff, it seems very natural as gardeners or, as homeowners to want to find ways to do it. And a lot of people who purchase their homes actually are so far removed from the gardening process, from just connecting with the earth, because a lot of people have actually lived in condos and like, what do I do? What do I do with this patch of land? I have to mow this? I'm like, you don't have to buy a sit-on lawnmower. You could probably get by with the push lawnmower or something like very simple things when I work with clients and they are looking at the property and they're like, oh, wouldn't this be nice? And then they don't even know the mechanics of maintaining it. And so it's actually really important in terms of it takes a lot of work to look really beautiful, right? To maintain to maintain lawns and gardens.
Absolutely. And at the same time, I think it's important not to be intimidated by that.
Yeah.
Your grandmother took a lifetime to get to that point where she brought you outside to plant with her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everybody goes through that process of not knowing anything.
Yeah.
And so for us to be kind of, humble in our stupidity is I think really empowering.
Yeah.
It's very affirming. It's like to say, I don't know anything about this, but it doesn't matter, because
it's true.
Just by planting a seed, you're going to get something happen. Yeah. And the dirty little secret is that even the most experienced professional gardeners and farmers have huge crop failures or plant failures or ornamental failures. And, when you see that beautiful aestheticized garden kind of at the end or on TV, you're like, well, there's no way that happens, but that's the truth of it. And I think, or with vegetables, like the vegetables you would see at a grocery store that are huge and they're, aesthetically perfect. And I'm like, yeah, but if you knew how much engineering went into making it that way and how little nutrient was in that vegetable or fruit to make it look like that and to make it sell at that weight, you wouldn't be as impressed or you wouldn't be so scared off to try it yourself.
Mm.
And I think that's, if we circle back a little bit to urban agriculture, it's to say, how do we get more people trying it themselves?
Yeah.
And, one thing that's really given us a not so gentle push in that direction has been COVID. Between being quarantined and not being able to go anywhere, what's an outdoor activity that we can do to, what's something that's going to give us some mental health and tranquility while we're going through this chaotic phase of history.
Yeah. Like being at one with the earth.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a real mental health benefit working with plants. And this is well established for years. It came to a head during COVID, right? Where people were, the seed companies were all sold out.
It's true. I totally forgot.
For 2 straight years. I mean, it wasn't even after 1 year they got back on. No, second year they were all sold out too. It's been nuts. Okay. That industry trying to cope with the demand for gardening materials during climate change. And then that's been exacerbated not only from COVID, but post-COVID, however we want to define that. Yeah. But certainly the economic recession that's come in the wake of things. And people are looking at a $7 head of lettuce, saying, where am I getting my vegetables from? Where am I getting groceries from? And I'm seeing more and more people, kind of in my neck of the woods of urban agriculture, saying, how do I convert my yard? How do I find community growing space? How do I plant on my balcony? How do I grow vegetables? Because I need to eat. And I need to eat affordably. And I need to eat healthily.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny because in our little patch of garden, the reason why it exists is because my wife was like, I want to be prepared for the apocalypse so that I can have this plot of land and know how to grow what's in season. And I remember we tried eating the food that was in season and how different that food tasted. Mm-hmm. Right? When you grow in your season. I mean, this is a part of the reason why I think in California, they had this whole thing of like 100 miles, like food from 100 miles. It doesn't quite work in Toronto because we don't have the climate to be growing all year.
Nope.
But it does raise an awareness of during the summer seasons or the spring, like what you can grow and when, and what will last through the winter. And certainly an appreciation for that.
And well, I think you also learn about, a different sensitivity to the what and the when, and preservation. Mm-hmm. If things are only going to be in season for a certain amount of time, how do we extend that season? And that might be through preservation of food. Mm-hmm. It might be through putting a hoop house up in your yard. Yeah. That's going to sort of,
help
keep your crops warmer, maybe for a month longer. Increasingly, even in the city, it's becoming little greenhouses and indoor operations and aquaponic operations. And, they've got their own problems, if you're looking for sort of a high nutrient vegetable, but they exist. And at the same time, there are, in our rush to get things like bananas, say, from, the other side of the world, or pineapples or things like this, we neglect maybe some other fruits that are more native to this area.
Yeah, totally.
Or have been neglected over time. I mean, the one that keeps coming up for me is the pawpaw. And I've never had it. I'm dying to grow it because, I keep hearing this referred to as this fruit that grows here. And it's a cross. It tastes something like a cross between a banana, maybe a citrus, a pineapple or something, and a custard.
Okay, cool.
All in one fruit.
This is like a native Ontario.
It's
North American.
Native to, from what I understand, I think it's native to certainly northeastern North America.
Okay.
I know people in the States that grow them, and I know people in Toronto that are growing them. It's just I haven't yet, and I'm like, we never learn about this fruit because it's not at the supermarket.
Yeah, it's not at the supermarket.
Because the stuff at the supermarket is bananas and pineapples that have been trucked across the continent.
Wow. Can you imagine what that would look like in terms of even climate change, of how things move? Like the flying of fruit over?
Yep. You bring up another important point. I mean, you mentioned a minute ago this idea of I want to be prepared for the apocalypse, and I admit that motivation myself, right? I think it's an urban fantasy that we all want to be prepared for the apocalypse. And so that, that was a motivation too, right? Could I grow my own food? Could I sustain myself? But at the same time, I think a more realistic motivation is to say, what's going to happen after fossil fuels are gone? Now that might also be the apocalypse. Who knows? But I think we're smart businesses. Urban agriculture, in the context we're describing right now, is already starting to think about what a post-fossil fuel economy looks like. Mm-hmm. And that's where, urban agriculture is really going to have its moment, I think, because it's going to be cheaper to get your food from the person down the street growing in their yard, maybe growing across 6 yards.
It's true. I mean, look, when I was a little kid and I would go to Chinatown, which is in Spadina, right? Spadina and Dundas, you would always see these little old Chinese ladies who had vegetables that they grew from their garden, and they would have it there for sale, whether it was scallions and, whatever like green veggies it was, and they would just sell it. And now it's fewer and fewer, and that's many, many, many years ago. But I just remember walking with my grandma and thinking, oh, look at all these little ladies who are being such entrepreneurs, bringing their, like knowledge and growing it and making some money off of it. And now it's like, and I would be like, oh, that's so quaint as a little kid, like, oh, cool, right? But now I'm like, maybe that is a reality, what you just talked about, which is cool and hip.
Yeah, I mean, it is cool and hip right now, and it's cool and hip because that apocalypse isn't here yet.
Yeah.
Or that post-fossil fuel economy isn't here yet.
Yeah.
But it's on its way. And so the hipness, I think, hopefully it catalyzes a moment where we are making that turn as we need to make that turn, not only for post-fossil fuels, but for climate change itself, right? It makes no sense that we need to truck foods across the continent.
Well, it's true.
It makes no sense that we need to industrialize meat production in feedlots when we could have farms that grow cover crops, capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sink it into the soil and produce meat at the same time. Like, all of this is possible.
In a micro farm?
Not a micro farm. No, I won't be growing cattle yet. But we're very hopeful actually for chickens.
Okay.
And so right now in Toronto, we have a municipal program called Urban Hens.
Okay.
And it's been in pilot now for several years.
Okay.
And there's, I believe, 4 to 6 wards around Toronto where you are allowed to keep chickens in your backyard for production of eggs.
Okay.
Up to 4 chickens, no roosters, but up to 4 chickens in your yard. And it's been a smashing success so far.
Okay.
Really helps with food security, obviously. You cannot sell your eggs at this time. So there's obviously a lot of concerns about, avian flu, that kind of spread.
Okay.
And so they've been, talking about, are we going to expand this to the whole city or not? And you've got this tug of war in council right now where they keep kicking the ball down into the future and saying, we'll extend the pilot for 1 more year. We'll extend the pilot for 1 more year.
Is it in our ward by any chance?
It is not in our ward. Otherwise, we would have chickens already.
Gotta talk to our counselor.
Yeah, no, it's not there yet. But please do talk to our counselor. I've sent my own letters to her. But basically, we've got a situation now where, City Hall is in disarray at the moment. And so it's probably going to be punted a year again.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, you've got people here who are like, I want these eggs. I need these eggs. I need this food. I need food security and I need food sovereignty.
Yeah.
And so in the kind of micro farm IKEA version that I'm describing, that is our livestock, right? Our chickens can be our livestock. Worms are my livestock. I keep hundreds and hundreds of worms right now for the production of compost.
How do you grow worms?
Well, you don't grow worms. I mean, you kind of have to start with some. You get some starter worms. You purchase those. I mean, you could grab them out of the ground if you knew which ones you're looking for.
Yeah.
They will come to your compost pile. If you make good compost, they will come to your compost pile for you.
If you build it, they will come.
If you build it, they will come. It's true. And so you can take some of those, and you're looking for a couple of particular species, and then you set up your little vermicomposter. And you're feeding them organics all the time, and they will multiply. They will, in something like, I think it's a half a year, they will double in population.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can have a pretty substantial worm composting presence. And if there was ever anything that's super beneficial for your soil, it's worm castings.
Okay.
Worm castings.
What are worm castings?
It's a nice way of saying poop.
Okay. Got it. Thanks.
But they don't actually poop because they don't really have a body. So like, it's just like stuff comes in one end of this tube, and then at the other end, it comes out of the tube, and it's been changed in some way.
Okay.
Via enzymatic processes and stuff like that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So, okay, I want to take this conversation sort of like from micro farming to the concept of why should city folk care about what's happening in rural farms?
Well, I think there's a lot of different answers to that question, Lee. I think partly because there is an artificial divide that's been set up between rural and urban.
Yeah.
And we treat it like it's meaningful. And I think for me, as I've gotten into this business, and I'm at the farmers market and meeting rural farmers who are my kind of, colleague vendors every weekend. And you realize that, they don't live in the 18th century, they don't, they have cell phones, like you know what I'm saying?
I guess it's like the imaginations
weird imaginaries of the urban kind of like, oh, we're this technologically advanced civilization. And the people from the country come on in their jalopies to sell us vegetables.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of patronizing, to be honest with you.
For sure.
And I think that disconnect between our own rural roots, our own rural histories. We were all rural people.
Yes.
Once upon a time.
Yeah.
I think that's the easier way to answer your question. Is like, why is that important? Because this divide is bullshit to begin with.
Totally.
We're all rural peoples.
Yeah.
And so we need to care about how their lands are stewarded as much as they need to care about how their lands are stewarded.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's pressures coming from the city, whether those are political pressures or economic pressures, that put a lot of kind of constraints on a rural farmer. And an economic push down to lower price all the time ends up having massive effects on the farm, the farming family, the farming community, and the soil, most importantly. And this is obviously my own bias, is the soil. And so that means, putting pesticides in, putting fungicides in,
right,
putting chemical fertilizers
for things
in,
to grow faster, to meet the demand.
Things to grow, using this kind of like green revolution, chemical farming based model of growing that, it makes vegetables, but it also kills life.
So ironic. Green revolution is actually so bad.
Yeah. And it's, we don't learn about any of this kind of stuff.
No, not at all.
I've done a little bit of a deep dive into, history of agriculture over the last couple of years. And you learn a lot. You learn a lot about how we've messed up.
Well, it's not just in terms of farming food communities. You see this in the conversations, politically. You see the conversations of like the urban, the rural. You see this in terms of even in housing, like the whole controversy around developing the green belt.
Yes.
And opening up croplands.
Yes.
And saying, oh, well, we need more affordable housing. So let's take the farmland. And there's different perspectives on that. I see it because even when I was helping clients find properties because they wanted to move out of the city and not really be surrounded by a lot of neighbors, and I would see all these rural properties of farmland, like for like 100 acres, and be like $1 million, right? And we just had this conversation about how, well, all that 100 acres is the nest egg, the retirement, like, their nest egg for the farmer. But they know that if they sell that land,
it's gone,
like really gone, like used for development of properties. I don't know, like it's all interconnected in many ways. And it's like, in terms of having conversations with many different people, thinking like, what happens if we lose all this land? What happens when the farmers are gone?
Yep.
Then what?
And I think this is why I worry sometimes if we restrict the dialogue to just, are we producing enough vegetables for ourselves as humans, as if we're the only ones that matter, right?
So what should the dialogue be open to?
Well, I think that dialogue needs to be open to all species. If you pave over the green belt, you're not just taking cropland out for humans.
Yeah.
You're taking habitat out for animals. You're taking carbon sequestration capacity out of the soil for microbes and worms and all the bugs that live under the earth that are keeping a really rich, the fact that we have so many atmospheric gases right now isn't necessarily because all the cars are on the road. It's because of all the pavement that allows for the cars to be on the road, because all of this used to be really rich and diverse. It totally was. Very biodiverse fields. If we go further west, prairies. If we go further north, sort of like peat bogs, muskegs, and all these different ecosystems. They're biodiverse. They are mixed species use. And they are holding and cycling nutrients and gases and minerals and all of this. And as soon as we kind of develop to an extreme, now we cut into that kind of natural cycling. And we cut out our capacity for growing food, but that's just what we do to ourselves. There's all these other things we do too. And so I'm kind of hesitant sometimes, talking farm shop to restrict it to, well, how are the humans going to benefit or suffer? And it's like, there's a lot more to it than that.
Well, it is. It's the bigger context of things. I mean, I was speaking to MPP Mary Margaret, who talked about how developing the Greenlands could be really difficult, would really impact floodplains.
Right.
Unnatural, consequences that we wouldn't naturally make a direct association with. And everything that you're talking about, it's like, what can we do to preserve the lands that we have and work, as we say, we're currently on land that was, prime agricultural land. And maybe we need to intensify and create more density and work with what we have. But what is, I guess, a beacon of hope is the creation of micro farms in the urban center.
Yeah. And I think rooftop farms would be another one.
Yeah.
I was at a really interesting conference the other day at Toronto Metropolitan University, where they have one of the only vegetable producing rooftop farms in all of the city. Of course, there's lots of ornamental gardens across Toronto, and the new city legislation for green roofs, insists that we need to have more green roof capacity. But for them to take green roof capacity and turn it into a farming situation where vegetables are being produced, opens up now a whole possibility to, okay, wait a sec. If we can retrofit all of these flat roof buildings,
tons,
and we look at the school board alone, the TDSB and the TCDSB are holding on to, some of the biggest square footage of rooftop and flat rooftop,
for sure.
The right grade for growing. Why isn't every school an urban farm?
It's so interesting. I mean, I find that super fascinating because I used to be in the renewable development world. And so I remember standing on Bay Street looking in one of the office towers looking down, it's like, wow, so many roofs.
Yeah.
Those could be solar, like rooms for solar panels, so we could have solar energy. But equally, you could have gardens or rooftop farms.
Yeah. They open up new challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there's some pretty intense sun exposure. There's some pretty intense wind exposure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, for people, we say the word urban in urban agriculture, like the city is this kind of homogenous
true
experience.
And it's not.
But if you're downtown in the condo region, I mean, that's a world that's highly, highly, highly disconnected to the ground.
Very much, like highly disconnected.
Highly, highly disconnected to the earth, the soil. And you could walk a long ways just to get to maybe like a little parkette to let your dog pee or something. And that's true. That might be all you get. And to sort of treat that urbanity as the same as maybe being in East York or in these old residential neighborhoods of kind of like early 20th century Toronto. Yeah. It's a very different experience. Now, all of a sudden, if you can put rooftop gardens, rooftop farms there and say, hey, you can have a meaningful experience, not just putting a planter out on your balcony, but going upstairs and actually growing vegetables as part of a community. Yeah. And it's a nice way to circle back again to you and your grandmother at the very beginning of our conversation. Growing vegetables isn't just about something that you're going to put in your stomach. It's about growing a community, about growing a relation. Totally. It's about growing a series of stories. You grow a lot more than just the carrot when you grow a carrot. For sure. I mean, it's so beautiful, because it's connecting so many things together. I'm just thinking about what you said about the rooftop gardens and growing a community and all of those things. And I just think for people who are watching, who might be thinking, okay, this is kind of cool, this concept. I live in an urban area, or I live on a condo. What can people actually do? Is there something that some tips that you might say, if you actually want to do a rooftop farm or you want to do something in your backyard, do you have some tips? Yeah. I mean, I think the first one, I've kind of said, hey, all you people who are on your computers too much, get outside and grow. But I think my first advice would be to get back on your computer. Okay. Strangely enough, right? Here's the paradox. Get back on your computer and get on Facebook and find Toronto Gardeners Facebook group. Okay. It's actually a group, right? It's called Toronto Gardeners. It's a Facebook group. Okay. I would say find the Facebook group called Grow Food Toronto. Grow Food Toronto. I would say find the Facebook group called Toronto Container Gardening or Toronto Balcony Gardening. Okay. There are groups of people all throughout social media who are doing these kinds of things. Cool. And if you're new to it, you don't have to be alone. Don't be alone. Yeah. If you're in a condo building, find it if your condo building has some kind of a social media where you can find like-minded people. They're out there. Yeah. Or ask them and say, hey, maybe we should start a garden in our common area. And instead of having flowers, we can grow bell peppers or whatever. Yeah. Hot peppers. I think, I think that is the first thing, is to find your soulmates, find your like-minded others. Yeah. We are in a very atomized kind of world. Yeah. And so to make those connections, if we say, hey, if you grow a carrot, it's going to grow more than the carrot. And likewise, if you grow the community, you might actually grow some carrots, that can happen. Sure. If you're new to it, maybe start with a couple of pots and start modestly. Plant a couple of seeds and make your mistakes. You're going to make mistakes every year. But what I often also do is at the end of a summer for myself, but I talk to my clients about this and I talk to other gardeners about this. I say, before you go into the winter, before you forget about your past experience this summer, is to notice what you did and what you want to get better at. Okay. And that's a very reflective thing. It's very reflective. Yeah. And it's hard to do that reflection in December, January. It's best to do it kind of right at the end of the summer, August, September, as you're harvesting, or if you didn't harvest, to find out why. and right then to say, what is it that I want to get better at for next year? And then you can pick away at it, because now it's gonna snow in Canada. It's, we're gonna be indoors again. We'll be back on our computers, but that's okay. It gives us something to surf about, instead of just kind of like mindlessly consuming media. Now we can have a task, and it's like, okay, I want to learn how to grow tomatoes next year.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I think that's really important, because there isn't like a communal space where if I'm, at the office and people are in the kitchen, like making food, and they're like, oh, I grew this in my backyard. I grew these pickles, or I grew these tomatoes. And the conversations, like, you hear about all the families who have grown all these tomatoes, and like, hey, we're going to have a tomato weekend, right? Where they do it, or get together and they can it. And it's such a big part of the Canadian experience in so many different families and so many different communities. And it's great to think that, wait a minute, just because more people are living in vertical spaces, that there's a way that, hey, you don't have to be disconnected. We can find ways, find your community. And maybe we need more community gardens. I know they exist, but maybe the demand is really important, right?
And for that, I mean, I would, if your clients, for example, if they're looking for this kind of knowledge and they're looking for that kind of space, look up Toronto Urban Growers. So TUG, Toronto Urban Growers. And I mean, they're an organization who is literally lobbying for more of these kinds of spaces, more community gardens, more urban agriculture, more, how do we take the situation that's presented to us and bend it a little bit to be able to do something new?
Yeah.
How do we ensure food justice and food security? And they're doing a really good job. And, if I can put in a little plug now, we're planning to have a fundraiser for Toronto Urban Growers, at a movie hall in the Beaches in a couple of months. And for this reason, it's important that people know that this exists.
Absolutely.
And again, that, you're not this isolated, alone person who doesn't know anything about gardening.
Yeah.
You're part of or potentially part of this really, really big community that's out there.
Yeah.
And they're just waiting to find you, and you're waiting to find them.
Yeah. So just get connected.
Just get going. Just plant something. Prepare to get addicted to it.
Love it.
And if you're somebody who likes to learn, and I think we all like to learn.
Yeah, for sure.
We might not have all enjoyed school the same, to the same degree, but I think people really like to learn. And, there is no shortage of learning that you can do with growing food and gardening.
For sure.
And it could be just from the very beginning of putting a seed in the ground, and the fact that somehow it sprouts.
Yeah.
That's mind blowing enough. And now you're going to learn about how to save those seeds at the end.
Yeah.
And that there are, seed networks that exist out there.
Seed networks,
who are trading seeds and holding on to like centuries old seeds.
Yeah.
Because the big five Monsanto-y seed companies are trying to patent everything and trying to restrict the seed economy in the entire world. But there are these underground networks of people who are holding on to seeds, and indigenous folks are holding on to seeds for like centuries. This is a big deal. And, you can get addicted to that kind of knowledge once you start learning about it.
It is. I mean, okay, listen, I wanted to read this quote that you shared, which I think is really great. Edible herbs and wild vegetables, plants growing on the mountain and in the meadow, are very high in nutritional value and are also useful as medicine. Food and medicine are not two different things. They are the front and back of one body. Chemically grown vegetables may be eaten for food, but they cannot be used as medicine. Masanobu Fukuoka, What is Human Food? In the One Straw Revolution, an introduction to natural farming.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a powerful, powerful book. It's about a Japanese man who was a microbiologist, and he was working for some kind of like agricultural customs agency. And he was doing, all this kind of testing, and he realized he had kind of like a dawning moment one day, kind of like, what the hell's going on here? Like, A, I don't believe in any of this, and B, you're doing it all wrong. And he was obviously mostly concerned about rice farming, being a traditional farmer in Japan. And he kind of went back to his family's, his parents were farmers, and he went back there and kind of like became a bit of a hermit for the next 35 years.
Okay.
To really put his methods into practice. And the methods basically were saying, how can I do as little as possible? And not only like, how can I do as little work, but how can I do as little needless work? You know, like for him, farming is about inventing work to do so that we can do it better. And it's like, well, nature already had it figured out.
Right.
And Indigenous folks knew that already.
Yeah.
And Indigenous folks talk about the fact that food and medicine are one and the same thing. And he evokes the same quote, you know, kind of centuries later, that when we allow nature to do its thing, the food that we're growing is also medicine at the same time. We don't need any medicine after that. It's nutrient dense. It is full of, you know, amino acids and enzymes and all the great things that we need to stay healthy, right? It's when we start chemically intervening in food and food production and agriculture that we start to increase yields, and we start to maybe produce more food or better looking food or bigger apples or whatever. But in the process, they've lost their nutrients. They've lost they've lost their taste.
Totally.
They've lost all these other qualities that are kind of qualities we've said it's okay to leave behind. And now we've got a food thing. We've got a widget of food, but we don't have medicine anymore. And so he said, great, we're very good now at working really hard at chemically intervening, at doing all these things to make food widgets. And I'm using I'm inventing the term food widget here. So we're still making food, but we're not making medicine anymore.
It's so powerful to think about food in that way and its connection to healing, nutrients, and feeding us, feeding our souls, feeding our bodies.
And for him, again, it's soil-based.
Yeah.
And so for me as a compost farmer making compost tea, I've come back to this book kind of every spring now for the last few years and read the whole thing cover to cover. I mean, because he's a bit of a philosopher at the same time as he's a farmer. Yeah. And so you read him for the farming and you end up getting this philosophy at the same time. But if you read him for philosophy, you end up getting these farming lessons at the same time. That's
really cool. I mean, yeah.
And what we're learning scientifically is that the same microbiome that's in the soil is going to ultimately be like the microbiome in our guts. And we're learning that our gut health is connected to our brain health. And so if we've got poor soil, we are going to have compromised gut microbiomes, and we're going to have compromised mental health because this is connected to this is connected to this. And one of these other sort of impacts that's come out of COVID is a real concern about mental health, but also what are some of the beyond the stressors of the situation? What are some of these physical factors that have to do with mental health? And a lot of it is to do with the foods we're eating.
You are what you eat, right?
You are what you eat. The gut health, the inflammation, the autoimmune diseases.
Yes.
The diabetes.
Yeah.
The Crohn's. I mean, we can go on and on and on with so many of these diseases that are attacking our system in inflammatory ways because our food isn't medicine and our soil isn't our microbiome in our gut.
Yeah. Well, that's a powerful thought to sit with, right? Like everything's interconnected, and how we treat ourselves or others, the nature. I mean, it's all interconnected. Climate change is a big deal. Right.
And I think that's the thing, right? With climate change, when you say, hey, everything's connected, and yes, this is the thing we need to remember. Not just remember, but remember. Again, Indigenous folks always knew that all things are connected.
Yeah.
And something interesting that I learned from an Indigenous speaker not long ago was, it was in Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass book, was the kind of inversion of where the human sits in this whole, everything's interconnected. And, Western Enlightenment says humans are at the top of the pinnacle. We're the smartest beings ever, and we figured it out, and we're at the top. And an indigenous wisdom says, no, we're the last ones to arrive here on planet Earth. And so we're the youngest. And we have to learn from all the other species. You know, all the other beings out there have things they can teach us. And we need to pay attention. It matters because we're all interconnected. When we look at something like climate change, we say, oh, woe is us humans. You know, it's too big for us to handle. It's global. Right. It's a big deal. And at the same time, it's like, well, wait, nobody's asking you to handle the globality of climate change. We're asking you to do something in your backyard, in your home community, in your set of relations.
Okay.
And if everybody starts to act in that little way of, hey, we're all doing little bits, we've seen how those accumulations can really matter.
It does matter. All the choices that we make, the intentionality of it has a ripple effect and they accumulate.
Yeah. And so how do we do that? How do we stop on the one hand saying we're the pinnacle of things? Or on the other hand, in the face of climate change, say, oh no, we're the ones who are going to suffer the most because the world is going to end. And it's like, well, no, the world isn't going to end. You know, human time on the world might end if we're not smart.
Yeah.
Or if we're not careful or if we don't make changes, but the world is going to keep going. And so to have that kind of humility to say, all right, now that I understand the world is going to keep going, what does that mean if I want to keep going with it? Or if we all want to keep going with it? And how do we start small? And make the world a livable place right here.
For sure. So parting thought of what people should do.
Well, I mean, I don't want to prescribe an ethics to people of what you should do. What I would love to see is everybody outdoors gardening and growing, you know. I would love to see everybody having a conversation with a farmer. Go to a farmer's market this summer and have conversations with a farmer and buy something from them. You know, ask them about how they grow their food. They take a lot of pride in how they grow that food. You know, they take a effing lot of pride in how they grow that food, and to ask them about it. Nobody is expecting urban farming to take over to such an extent that we're never going to need a rural farmer again.
Of course.
The idea, I think, is more that, you know, whatever we're doing can supplement what ecological farmers are doing outside of the city. If we'd only listen to them, you know, if we would only ask them about what they're doing and share in that pride.
Yeah. No, I think thank you so much for that. I think that's so wise and so true. Like in terms of just go talk to your local farmer. I mean, we have so many community, you know, like farmers that come into the city, right? And just go out to your local community.
Practice observation, I think.
Yeah.
You know, like don't look at the plant this summer, but look at the bugs that come visit the plant.